The ancient initiates believed that a fearful mind could walk through paradise and experience suffering, while an awakened mind could stand in chaos and still find order. They called this the hidden law. Few were allowed to study it. The initiates of Egypt believed that a fearful mind could turn abundance into suffering, while a disciplined mind could walk through catastrophe untouched. To them, reality was not only physical, it was mental first. Today, you will uncover why the ancient mystery schools guarded consciousness as the greatest force in existence, and why Stoic philosophers guarded their thoughts like sacred territory. Think carefully about the last difficult moment in your life. Was the suffering created entirely by the event itself, or by the meaning your mind attached to it? Ancient sages believed this question separated ordinary people from awakened ones. Chapter 1. The universe is mental. There is a sentence hidden inside the Kybalion that has disturbed readers for generations because of its terrifying simplicity. The all is mind, the universe is mental. At first glance, it sounds symbolic, poetic even. But the Hermetic initiates who preserved this teaching did not treat it as metaphor. They believed it described the actual structure of reality itself. According to ancient Hermetic wisdom, the world human beings experience is filtered through consciousness long before it is interpreted as physical reality. In other words, thought is not merely reacting to life. Thought is continuously participating in the construction of experience. The Egyptian mystery schools taught this principle in secret chambers hidden beneath temples, illuminated only by torchlight. Young initiates were not immediately given knowledge. First, they were observed. The priests believed an undisciplined mind could misuse spiritual understanding and become trapped by illusion rather than freed from it. One ancient story tells of a student brought before a Hermetic teacher after years of preparation. The teacher placed two identical objects before him and asked a strange question: "Which one has power over you?" The student looked confused. They appeared identical in every way. The teacher then replied, "Whichever one your mind gives meaning to." The lesson was simple but devastating. Human beings rarely experience reality directly. They experience their interpretation of reality. Fear, expectation, memory, belief, and emotional conditioning all become lenses shaping perception. A man expecting betrayal notices every suspicious detail. A man expecting opportunity notices every open door. Same world, different consciousness. Marcus Aurelius would later echo this truth centuries afterward, when he wrote in Meditations that life is shaped by the color of one's thoughts. The Stoics understood something similar to the Hermetic masters. Perception determines experience more than circumstance itself. This is why ancient traditions placed extraordinary importance on internal discipline. They believed uncontrolled thinking slowly becomes invisible architecture. Thought patterns repeated over years harden into identity, expectation, and behavior. Eventually, people no longer realize they are living inside structures their own consciousness helped build. The Hermetic initiates compared this process to constructing a temple stone by stone. One thought alone seems harmless. One fearful assumption seems temporary, but repeated daily, these thoughts become walls, invisible walls. A merchant convinced he will fail begins avoiding risk unconsciously. A lonely person expecting rejection subtly withdraws from connection. Someone obsessed with conflict begins noticing hostility everywhere. The external world starts reflecting internal orientation, not magically. Pattern by pattern, this is the hidden psychological brilliance beneath Hermetic philosophy. Consciousness filters attention Attention shapes behavior, and behavior influences outcome. Ancient teachers observed this long before modern psychology gave it language. The mystery schools, therefore, trained awareness before action. Students practiced long periods of silence because silence exposed mental chaos. They practiced observation because most human beings, according to Hermetic teaching, move through life half asleep inside unconscious thought loops. The goal was not positive thinking in the modern superficial sense. It was mastery of perception itself. Because what controls your inner world eventually colors your outer world. An old Egyptian initiate once described the human mind as a sacred garden constantly accepting seeds. The tragedy, he warned, is that most people never choose what is planted there. Fear enters, resentment enters, despair enters, and over years those seeds become emotional environments mistaken for reality itself. The Hermetic masters believed this was humanity's forgotten prison, not chains of iron, but chains of unconscious thought. Yet the teaching was never meant to create fear. It was meant to restore responsibility. If consciousness helps shape experience, then awareness becomes power, not power over others, power over perception, and perception quietly influences the direction of an entire life. This is why the ancient schools guarded mental discipline so carefully. They believed that whoever learns to govern thought begins slowly reclaiming authority over reality itself. Not instantly, not magically, but through the invisible architecture consciousness builds every single day. Guard your inner world carefully. It becomes the world you live inside. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Wisdom of Egypt. Long before modern civilization debated consciousness, the priests of ancient Egypt built entire spiritual systems around a dangerous idea. Human awareness survives death, and even more unsettling, they believed consciousness continues shaping reality beyond the physical world itself. This belief appears throughout the Book of the Dead, one of the most mysterious spiritual texts ever discovered. Contrary to popular assumption, it was not merely a guide for burial rituals. It was a manual for navigating states of consciousness. The Egyptians believed the soul entered realms shaped partly by vibration, memory, speech, and inner condition. A disturbed mind encountered confusion. A disciplined consciousness moved with clarity. To modern ears, this sounds symbolic. But ancient Egyptian mysticism treated consciousness as a living force with creative power. Words themselves were considered sacred technology. Priests spent years mastering precise speech patterns, chants, and vibrational rituals because they believed sound influenced both inner awareness and external reality. Speech was not casual, it carried force. One forgotten temple inscription warned, "The tongue shapes the path of the soul." This was not merely moral advice. It reflected a deeper belief that repeated language conditions consciousness itself. A fearful person repeating despair shapes internal reality accordingly. A disciplined mind repeating clarity strengthens perception and emotional stability. Agon, the pattern appears. Consciousness first, experience second. There is an ancient account of a young scribe training within a temple school near Thebes. He was intelligent but emotionally unstable, easily angered and consumed by envy toward others. His teacher noticed this immediately. Instead of assigning intellectual study, the priest gave him an unusual task. For 30 days he was forbidden from speaking negatively about himself, others, or fate itself. At first the student believed the exercise meaningless, but within weeks something strange began happening. His emotional reactions softened, his thinking slowed. Situations that once felt hostile seemed less threatening. The external world had not changed dramatically, but his perception had. The Egyptian priests understood what modern psychology would later rediscover: repeated internal and external language conditions, emotional reality. Speech becomes atmosphere, atmosphere becomes interpretation, interpretation becomes lived experience. This is why sacred words held such importance in ancient traditions. Language was seen as vibrational architecture shaping consciousness over time. Even after death, Egyptians believed consciousness carried its inner condition forward. The afterlife realms described in the Book of the Dead often resemble symbolic psychological states: fear creating confusion, awareness creating clarity. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the teaching remains powerful. Human beings do not simply encounter reality, they participate in shaping how reality is experienced. The priests guarded these teachings carefully because they feared misuse. A mind dominated by greed, fear, or hatred could distort perception endlessly. But a disciplined consciousness could perceive deeper order hidden beneath surface chaos. This idea later echoed through Hermeticism, Stoicism, Gnosticism, and even Eastern philosophy. Consciousness is not passive, it is active, and what fills consciousness gradually shapes the reality a person inhabits. Ancient Egyptian initiates, therefore, practiced silence, breath control, focused attention, and sacred recitation not as superstition, but as methods of stabilizing awareness itself, because to them consciousness was the true temple, not the stone structures, not the pyramids, the mind. And whoever mastered the inner temple, they believed, could move through both life and death with clarity untouched by fear. Most people today search endlessly for control over external circumstances while remaining strangers to their own consciousness. The Egyptians considered this backward. They taught that inner disorder eventually reflects outward, but inner harmony begins subtly reorganizing perception, behavior, and experience over time. This is the forgotten wisdom hidden beneath the sands of ancient Egypt. Reality is experienced through consciousness first, and consciousness becomes shaped by what it repeatedly consumes, believes, and speaks into existence. Chapter 3. The Mirror Principle. Among the fragments of ancient wisdom that survived the collapse of empires, few sentences have carried more mystery than the line carved into the legendary emerald tablet: "As above, so below." For centuries, alchemists, mystics, and philosophers treated these words as sacred code. Some believed they described the movement of stars. Others believed they referred to hidden spiritual dimensions. But the deeper initiates understood something far more personal and immediate. The phrase described the relationship between inner consciousness and outer experience. The ancients believed reality mirrors internal structure the way still water reflects a face. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently over time. The emotional atmosphere within a person slowly shapes the atmosphere around them. Fear alters perception, bitterness alters interpretation, hope alters behavior, and behavior quietly influences outcomes. This is why two individuals can enter the same environment and encounter entirely different realities. One notices hostility everywhere, another notices opportunity. One feels trapped, another sees movement and possibility. The world appears different because consciousness filters experience before experience is understood consciously. An old Hermetic teaching tells the story of an apprentice alchemist who desperately wanted wealth, influence, and recognition. He spent years studying sacred texts, memorizing symbols, and practicing rituals. Yet his life remained filled with conflict. Frustrated, He accused his teacher of withholding the true secrets. The teacher listened carefully before handing him a tarnished bronze mirror. "Carry this everywhere for 30 days, he said. The student obeyed, though he saw no purpose in the task. Each morning he looked into the mirror. Each night he carried it through crowded streets, marketplaces, and temple halls. After several weeks, something strange began happening. He noticed how angry he looked even in silence. He noticed suspicion in his eyes while speaking to others. He noticed envy rising automatically whenever someone else succeeded. The mirror exposed what had previously remained invisible. When he returned, the teacher finally explained, "You wanted to change your world before seeing the consciousness creating it." That sentence haunted the student for years, because the ancients believed emotional patterns eventually become life patterns. Repeated fear becomes cautious behavior. Repeated resentment poisons relationships. Repeated despair narrows perception until possibilities become invisible. This process rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It occurs gradually, like water carving stone. One thought becomes a habit. One habit becomes temperament. Temperament becomes identity. Identity begins shaping reality. Modern psychology would later discover similar principles through studies of attention bias, emotional conditioning, and behavioral reinforcement. But ancient wisdom traditions observed these patterns long before scientific language existed. The Hermetic masters understood that consciousness does not simply react to the world. It organizes interpretation of the world continuously. A suspicious mind gathers evidence for danger. A grateful mind gathers evidence for meaning. Neither sees reality completely objectively. Each sees through internal orientation. This is why the Emerald Tablet fascinated generations of seekers. It suggested that the visible world and the invisible world are reflections of each other. Internal disorder eventually manifests externally. Internal harmony subtly reorganizes experience over time, not through magic alone, through perception, emotion, attention, and action interacting continuously. There is a reason ancient alchemists used the language of transmutation. They were not only speaking about metals, they were speaking about consciousness itself. To transform life, one first transforms the inner state interpreting life. Anxiety repeated daily becomes a lens. Bitterness repeated daily becomes a prison. But awareness repeated daily becomes liberation. The ancients warned that most human beings remain trapped because they attempt to alter circumstances without understanding the emotional patterns quietly generating those circumstances. A man consumed by chaos creates conflict wherever he goes. A woman ruled by fear unknowingly avoids opportunity. A person addicted to resentment eventually experiences the world as hostile. And then they conclude reality itself is cruel. The Hermetic teachers challenged this assumption directly. They believed the external world often acts as a mirror, revealing unconscious inner patterns. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it restores responsibility, but it also restores power. Because if consciousness influences experience, then awareness becomes the beginning of transformation. The ancient sages therefore taught students to observe emotional repetition carefully, not suppress emotions. Observe them. What repeatedly angers you? What repeatedly frightens you? What story do you tell yourself about life every single day? The answers reveal the architecture of consciousness itself, and according to the Emerald Tablet, that architecture eventually reflects outward as within. So without the mirror never truly stops reflecting. Chapter 4, The Stoic Secret of Perception. In the 2nd century, while plague spread across the Roman Empire and war consumed its borders. One of the most powerful men on earth sat alone writing private thoughts by candlelight. That man was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, witness to famine, betrayal, political corruption, and mass death. Yet the writings preserved in Meditations rarely sound like the thoughts of a ruler surrounded by chaos. Instead, they read like instructions from a man struggling to master his own consciousness while the world around him unraveled. This is the secret many people misunderstand about Stoicism. The Stoics were not emotionless. They were disciplined observers of perception. Marcus Aurelius understood something ancient Hermetic teachers also believed. Human suffering often comes less from events themselves and more from the meaning consciousness assigns to those events. He wrote repeatedly that external circumstances do not automatically control the mind. Interpretation does. A storm is neutral until consciousness labels it disaster. Failure is neutral until consciousness transforms it into identity. Pain is real, but the stories surrounding pain often multiply suffering beyond the original wound. This insight gave Stoicism extraordinary psychological power. During one brutal military campaign, Roman soldiers reportedly suffered freezing temperatures, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Morale collapsed. Fear spread rapidly through the camps. Yet Marcus Aurelius continued emphasizing internal order over external panic, not because circumstances were easy, but because he believed consciousness determines experience far more deeply than circumstance alone. Two soldiers can endure identical hardship. One becomes psychologically destroyed, while the other grows stronger through meaning and discipline. Same conditions, different consciousness. This idea appears repeatedly throughout ancient wisdom traditions. The Stoics simply expressed it with remarkable clarity. They trained perception the way warriors train combat. A Stoic practitioner observed thoughts carefully, questioning emotional reactions before obeying them automatically. Fear was examined, anger was slowed, impulsive interpretation was interrupted. Because the Stoics believed an uncontrolled mind becomes enslaved to circumstance, a controlled mind remains internally free even during chaos. There is a story preserved from Roman tradition about a philosopher visiting a wealthy nobleman who constantly complained despite living in luxury. Every inconvenience disturbed him. Every criticism wounded him deeply. The philosopher listened quietly before asking a single question. Are you suffering from life or from your opinion of life? The nobleman reportedly became furious. But the question remained, and it remains relevant now. Modern people often assume reality itself creates emotional states directly. Yet the Stoics observed that interpretation acts as a hidden intermediary between event and experience. One person loses money and sees humiliation. Another sees instruction. One sees ending. Another sees redirection. Perception quietly determines emotional reality. Marcus Aurelius therefore treated mental discipline as sacred responsibility. He understood that the mind constantly absorbs impressions from the external world. Without awareness, those impressions dominate consciousness automatically. Fear spreads, outrage spreads, panic spreads. The Stoics saw emotional contagion centuries before modern psychology studied it scientifically. This is why they practiced internal command relentlessly, not denial command. To them, freedom did not mean controlling the world. It meant refusing to surrender consciousness entirely to external conditions. The ancient Stoics believed that whoever masters perception gains a form of power untouched by circumstance. not because suffering disappears, but because consciousness stops multiplying suffering unnecessarily. This distinction changes everything. The plague still existed during Marcus Aurelius's reign. War still existed. Loss still existed. Yet he refused to allow external chaos complete authority over his inner state. And that is the hidden psychological brilliance inside Stoicism. Reality is experienced through consciousness first. A fearful mind lives inside fear even during peace. A disciplined mind can maintain clarity even during disorder. The external world matters, but perception shapes how that world is lived internally. This is why ancient Stoics guarded attention carefully. They understood that repeated focus becomes emotional conditioning, and emotional conditioning becomes character. Character then shapes destiny, not through fate alone, but through repeated perception becoming repeated behavior over time. The Stoic secret, therefore, was never about becoming cold or detached from life. It was about refusing to become unconsciously possessed by every passing emotion, fear, or external disturbance, because consciousness determines experience. And whoever learns to govern consciousness begins quietly reclaiming authority over reality itself. Chapter 5, Maya. The illusion of reality. Thousands of years ago, long before modern psychology began studying perception and identity, the sages of the Upanishads described human existence with a single unsettling word, Maya. It is often translated as illusion, but the ancient Vedic teachers meant something deeper than simple deception. Maya was the condition of mistaking appearance for ultimate reality. It was the veil through which human beings experience the world while forgetting the deeper nature of consciousness itself. The sages believed most people move through life hypnotized by surface appearances, possessions, status, fear, identity, social roles, emotional drama, never realizing they are interpreting reality through conditioned perception. In one ancient teaching, a student approaches a master and asks why human beings suffer despite constantly pursuing happiness. The master leads him to a still lake at sunrise. "Tell me what you see," the teacher asks. The student describes the mountains, the water, the sky, the reflections dancing across the surface. The master then throws a stone into the lake. The reflections shatter instantly. "What changed?" he asks. "The water moved," the student replies. The teacher nods slowly. "Reality did not change. Your perception changed." This was the essence of Maya. The external world exists, but human beings rarely experience it directly. Instead, they experience interpretations filtered through memory, fear, desire, identity, and emotional conditioning. A jealous mind sees threats everywhere. A fearful mind sees danger everywhere. An ego-driven mind sees insult everywhere. The Upanishads taught that consciousness itself remains untouched beneath these distortions, like the still depths beneath turbulent water. But most people become so identified with surface waves that they forget the deeper awareness observing them. This is where the ego enters the ancient teachings. In Vedic philosophy, the ego is not simply arrogance. It is mistaken identity. It is the false self constructed from attachment, comparison, fear, and social conditioning. The ego constantly whispers, "You are your success. You are your failure. You are your reputation. You are what others think of you." Over time, people begin living inside these mental constructions as though they are absolute truth. The sages warned this creates suffering because the ego depends entirely on unstable external conditions. Wealth changes, youth fades, social approval shifts like weather. Anyone whose identity depends entirely on outer conditions becomes psychologically fragile. The ancient Vedic masters therefore pursued something radically different: awareness beyond illusion, not escape from life. Clarity within life. There is a story from the Upanishads about a prince raised in luxury who became obsessed with controlling every aspect of his world. He feared loss constantly. He distrusted others. Despite immense power, his mind remained restless. One evening he encountered a wandering sage meditating beneath a tree outside the palace walls. The prince asked why the old man appeared peaceful despite owning nothing. The sage replied, "Because I stopped confusing passing shadows with myself." The prince did not understand. So the sage handed him a polished bowl filled with water and instructed him to carry it through the crowded marketplace without spilling a drop. Guards walked beside him, threatening punishment if even one drop escaped. The prince completed the task, trembling with concentration. When he returned, the sage asked, "What did you notice in the marketplace?" The prince realized he remembered almost nothing: no music, no arguments, no distractions. His attention had been entirely absorbed. The sage smiled. Where attention goes, reality forms. This teaching appears repeatedly across ancient traditions. Human beings do not merely observe life passively. Attention shapes emotional experience continuously. The Upanishads therefore treated awareness as liberation. The more conscious a person becomes of thought, emotion, and egoic reaction, the less trapped they become inside conditioned perception. This did not mean denying pain or difficulty. The sages were not naive. Rather, they believed suffering multiplies when consciousness unconsciously identifies with every passing thought and emotion. Fear appears, and the ego says, "This is who I am." Anger appears, and the ego says, "This defines reality." Loss appears, and the ego concludes, "Everything is ruined." But deeper awareness observes without immediate identification. The Vedic masters compared ordinary consciousness to dreaming. Inside dreams, everything feels absolutely real until awakening occurs. In the same way, most people live inside psychological narratives they never question: the story of inadequacy, the story of resentment, the story of limitation. And because these narratives repeat daily, they become convincing. Maya strengthens itself through repetition, but awareness interrupts repetition. This is why ancient spiritual disciplines emphasized meditation, silence, breath control, and observation. These practices weakened identification with unconscious mental patterns and revealed a deeper layer of consciousness beneath them, a consciousness not dependent on fear, not dependent on status, not dependent on external validation. The sages believed this deeper awareness was the true self hidden beneath illusion, still clear, untouched, and once glimpsed directly. Ordinary reality never appears the same again, because you begin realizing how much of human suffering is not reality itself, but unconscious interpretation projected onto reality continuously. The illusion weakens the moment it is observed, and awareness begins where unconscious identification ends. Chapter 6: The Divine Spark Within. Among the most forbidden spiritual movements of the ancient world were the Gnostics, mystics who believed humanity carried something extraordinary hidden deep within consciousness itself. They called it the divine spark, not metaphorically, literally. The Gnostics taught that beneath conditioning, fear, ego, and social identity exists a fragment of divine intelligence, connected to a higher reality beyond ordinary perception. Human beings were not empty creatures abandoned in a meaningless universe. They were sleeping participants in a much larger spiritual mystery. But according to Gnostic teachings, humanity forgot its true nature. This forgetting became the central tragedy of human existence. One Gnostic text describes the soul as a light buried beneath layers of sleep. Another compares ordinary human consciousness to a prisoner wandering inside a maze while carrying the key the entire time. The implication was revolutionary. The power people seek externally already exists internally. This idea terrified many authorities throughout history because it shifted spiritual authority away from external systems and back toward inner awakening. The Gnostics believed salvation did not come through blind obedience alone. It came through gnosis, direct inner knowing. Self-knowledge became sacred, not self-obsession, self-recognition. An ancient story tells of a seeker who traveled across kingdoms searching for wisdom. He studied under priests, philosophers, astrologers, and kings. Yet despite decades of searching, he remained inwardly restless. Finally, an old mystic asked him a single question: "Why do you search everywhere except the place where truth has always been waiting?" The seeker asked where that place was. The mystic touched his chest gently. Within, this inward turn became central to Gnostic thought. Human beings spend enormous energy trying to control the external world while remaining strangers to their own consciousness. The Gnostics believed this inner disconnection creates psychological fragmentation. People become controlled by fear without understanding fear, ruled by desire without understanding desire, trapped by identity without understanding identity. Awakening begins when awareness turns inward honestly, not to escape the world, but to perceive clearly. This is why many Gnostic texts describe ordinary society as sleepwalking. Most people inherit beliefs, fears, and definitions of success unconsciously. They live according to mental programs absorbed from family, culture, trauma, and collective conditioning. Few stop to ask, who would I be without these inherited patterns? The Gnostics believed that question opens the doorway to awakening, because beneath social identity exists deeper consciousness untouched by external labels, a consciousness linked to what Hermetic traditions call divine mind. This connection explains why so many ancient systems emphasized inner stillness. Noise strengthens conditioning. Silence reveals what conditioning hides. There is a reason mystical traditions repeatedly sent seekers into deserts, caves, mountains, monasteries, or periods of isolation. External silence weakens distraction, allowing hidden patterns to surface. And when hidden patterns surface, transformation becomes possible. The Gnostics also warned that many people fear awakening because false identity feels safer than uncertainty. The ego clings desperately to familiar narratives even when those narratives create suffering. A person may unconsciously prefer limitation because limitation feels predictable. This is why awakening often feels uncomfortable at first. Illusions collapse, old identities weaken, conditioned patterns become visible. But beneath that discomfort emerges something ancient traditions considered sacred: inner authority, not arrogance, not domination, clarity. The realization that consciousness is not merely reacting to reality mechanically, it is participating in experience continuously through perception, attention, emotion, and identity. This realization changes how a person moves through life. Fear loses some of its control. External approval loses some of its power. The endless search outside oneself begins slowing. Because the individual starts recognizing that the deepest transformation was never external to begin with. It was hidden within awareness itself. The Gnostics believed humanity forgot this truth intentionally over centuries of distraction, fear, and conditioning, but they also believed remembrance is possible. not through blind belief. Through direct observation of consciousness, through self-knowledge, through awakening from unconscious identification, the divine spark they taught was never absent, only buried. And the moment a person begins truly observing the mind, questioning inherited reality, and reclaiming awareness from unconscious patterns, the buried light begins returning slowly into view. Chapter 7. The Taoist Law of Flow. In ancient China, there lived a sage who watched rivers more carefully than kings watched armies, while rulers obsessed over conquest, strategy, and control. The old master spent hours sitting beside moving water in silence. His students found this strange. They expected secret rituals, hidden formulas, or mystical ceremonies. Instead, they found a quiet man studying currents. One day, a young warrior approached him in frustration. "I have trained for years," the warrior said, "yet life continues resisting me. Every victory creates another struggle. Every achievement brings exhaustion. Tell me the hidden law that governs success." The old master pointed toward the river. "Watch carefully," he said. The warrior stared at the rushing water. "It moves around every obstacle," the master continued. "It does not argue with stone. It does not panic before mountains. Yet over time, even mountains surrender to it." The warrior remained silent. Then the master spoke the principle that sits at the center of Taoist wisdom. What flows endures. This became one of the deepest teachings of the Tao Te Ching. The Taoist believed human beings suffer because they constantly force reality instead of aligning with it. Modern minds often assume power means aggression, pressure, constant action, and endless control. But Taoist sages observed something entirely different. Force creates resistance. The harder a person grips water, the faster it escapes. The harder the mind clings desperately to outcomes, the more tension enters consciousness. That tension distorts perception, clouds judgment, and weakens awareness. The Taoists called this imbalanced disconnection from the Tao, the natural order underlying existence itself. To them, life was not chaos. It was movement governed by hidden rhythm. Seasons changed naturally, rivers flowed naturally, trees grew without strain. Even the stars moved according to patterns beyond human control. Yet human beings fought constantly against reality itself. They forced conversations, forced identities, forced outcomes, forced timelines, and then wondered why exhaustion followed them everywhere. The Taoist sages therefore taught the principle of Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action. But the phrase does not mean laziness or passivity. It means action aligned with reality instead of action driven by panic, ego, or fear. A skilled archer does not wrestle the bow violently. A master swordsman does not waste movement. A wise mind does not exhaust itself fighting every passing circumstance. Instead, awareness becomes calm enough to sense timing. This sensitivity to timing appears throughout ancient Taoist stories. One tale describes a woodcarver whose creations seemed impossibly beautiful. Kings and nobles traveled across provinces to witness his work. When asked about his secret, the craftsman explained that before touching wood, he spent days quieting his mind completely. "If my mind is disturbed," he said, "I cannot see the hidden form already waiting inside the tree." This is profoundly important. The Taoists believed inner agitation blinds perception. A frantic mind misses opportunities. An ego-driven mind forces outcomes prematurely. Fear interrupts natural intelligence. But calm awareness sharpens perception. The modern world often mistakes constant movement for progress. Yet ancient Taoist wisdom warned that frantic energy frequently creates unnecessary resistance. A desperate person pushes people away unconsciously. An anxious mind sabotages clarity. A rigid personality breaks under pressure while flexibility survives. This is why Laozi repeatedly compared wisdom to water. Water adapts without losing itself. It yields without becoming weak. It moves naturally toward openings instead of colliding blindly with obstacles. Softness becomes strength. Stillness becomes intelligence. There is an old Taoist saying, "Muddy water clears best when left alone." The ancients understood something modern psychology now confirms. Overstimulation weakens cognitive clarity. Emotional panic narrows awareness. Stress creates reactive thinking. A disturbed nervous system struggles to perceive reality accurately. This is why calm consciousness changes outcomes. Not magically, practically. The calmer mind notices possibilities the frantic mind misses. The emotionally balanced person responds strategically instead of impulsively. The aligned individual conserves energy while others waste it fighting unnecessary battles. This is the hidden power of Taoist flow. It does not reject action, it refines action. A Taoist master once told a ruler obsessed with expanding his empire, "The more tightly you try to control life, the more life escapes your control." The ruler ignored him. Years later, his kingdom collapsed under the weight of its own aggression. The Taoists saw this pattern everywhere. Excess force eventually creates collapse. Nature itself operates through balance. Too much rigidity becomes fragility. Too much striving becomes exhaustion. Too much fear becomes blindness. But alignment creates endurance. This teaching becomes deeply psychological when applied internally. Most human beings fight themselves constantly. They resist emotions instead of understanding them. They force identities that conflict with their deeper nature. They chase external approval while ignoring internal truth. And this inner resistance fragments consciousness. The Taoists believed peace begins when the war within ends. Not because problems disappear, but because awareness stops multiplying struggle unnecessarily. A calm mind sees clearly. A clear mind acts precisely. Precise action changes reality quietly over time. The ancient masters therefore trained themselves to become inwardly still before acting outwardly. They understood that consciousness shapes outcomes long before external results appear. And in a world addicted to force, the Taoist path remains revolutionary because sometimes the greatest power is not pushing harder, but aligning more deeply. Chapter 8. The Hidden Power of Attention. There is a force shaping your reality every moment of your life, yet most people barely notice it. Attention. The ancients understood something modern civilization has almost forgotten. Whatever consistently holds human attention eventually shapes consciousness itself. What you feed grows. Ancient monks knew this long before neuroscience existed. In remote monasteries scattered across deserts, mountains, forests, and caves, initiates spent years training one ability above all others: concentration, not because they wanted escape from reality, because they believed attention determines reality as experienced internally. A distracted mind becomes weak, a focused mind becomes powerful. There is a story from an old Buddhist monastery about a young novice who complained constantly during meditation training. He found silence unbearable. His thoughts wandered endlessly. Every sound disturbed him. One evening the master handed him a candle and instructed him to protect its flame while crossing a windy mountain path at night. The student walked carefully, guarding the small light with complete concentration. By the time he returned, hours had passed. The master asked him what thoughts distracted him during the journey. "Nah," the student replied. If my attention drifted, the flame would die. The teacher smiled gently. That is meditation. The lesson was simple but profound. Attention directs consciousness. Whatever repeatedly captures awareness begins organizing emotional and psychological reality over time. Fear-focused attention strengthens fear. Grateful attention strengthens meaning. Angry attention strengthens agitation. The mind slowly becomes shaped by whatever it consumes repeatedly. Ancient spiritual traditions, therefore, treated attention as sacred energy. Monks avoided chaotic environments intentionally because they understood the mind absorbs surrounding influences constantly. Modern life, however, operates almost entirely against this principle. Screens flash endlessly, outrage cycles dominate attention, news feeds compete aggressively for emotional reaction. Advertising systems monetize distraction itself. Human attention has become one of the most valuable commodities on earth, and most people surrender it unconsciously. The result is what many ancient traditions would describe as fragmented consciousness. A scattered mind loses depth, a distracted mind loses awareness. A constantly stimulated nervous system loses inner stillness. This fragmentation weakens perception itself. Modern neuroscience now confirms that repeated distraction damages concentration, increases anxiety, weakens emotional regulation, and conditions the brain toward compulsive stimulation. Yet, ancient wisdom traditions recognized these patterns centuries ago through direct observation of consciousness. The monks understood that wherever attention repeatedly flows, identity slowly follows. A man consumed by outrage eventually becomes emotionally reactive. A woman consumed by envy eventually loses inner peace. A society addicted to stimulation loses the capacity for reflection, and without reflection, unconscious patterns dominate behavior automatically. This is why so many ancient schools emphasized practices involving focused awareness, breath observation, prayer repetition, mantras, contemplation, silent walking, candle meditation. These were not meaningless rituals. They were methods for reclaiming authority over attention itself. Because attention is creative, whatever consciousness repeatedly returns to becomes psychologically strengthened. An old desert mystic once said, "The mind becomes dyed by the color of its attention." That sentence explains much of modern suffering. People absorb fear daily and wonder why anxiety grows. They absorb outrage daily and wonder why peace disappears. They absorb distraction constantly and wonder why meaning feels distant. Attention is nourishment for consciousness. The ancients believed this so strongly that many initiates guarded their mental environment carefully. They chose conversations deliberately. They avoided unnecessary noise. They limited emotional chaos intentionally, not from weakness, from understanding. They knew consciousness is impressionable. One ancient monk compared attention to water flowing through a garden. Wherever the water consistently moves, growth appears naturally. Neglected areas wither. Human consciousness follows the same principle. If attention feeds fear continuously, fear grows roots. If attention feeds purpose, clarity strengthens. If attention feeds awareness itself, deeper perception emerges. This is why modern distraction is spiritually dangerous. Constant stimulation keeps awareness trapped at surface level. The mind becomes reactive rather than reflective. Silence begins feeling uncomfortable because hidden thoughts immediately surface when distraction disappears. But the ancient traditions insisted that transformation begins precisely there, in still attention, noticing thought, noticing emotional reaction, noticing unconscious habits before obeying them automatically. Awareness deepens when attention stabilizes, and stabilized attention changes how reality is experienced entirely, because eventually you realize something the ancient sages understood long ago. Your life is shaped not only by what happens to you, but by what consistently occupies your consciousness every day. What you repeatedly feed becomes stronger. What you repeatedly focus on becomes emotionally real. And what controls your attention quietly influences the architecture of your entire inner world. Chapter 9. Emotional energy creates reality. The ancients did not believe emotions were random interruptions of the mind. They believed emotions were forces, invisible currents shaping perception, behavior, memory, and ultimately the experience of reality itself. Long before modern psychology explored emotional conditioning, ancient mystics observed that human beings do not merely see the world as it is. They see the world through the emotional state dominating consciousness at that moment. Fear changes reality, so does anger, so does gratitude, so does peace. A frightened mind enters a room already expecting danger. It notices threats first, remembers negative signals more intensely, and interprets uncertainty pessimistically. Meanwhile, a calm mind in the exact same environment perceives possibilities the fearful mind cannot even recognize. The external world may remain unchanged, yet experience changes completely. This is why ancient wisdom traditions treated emotional discipline as sacred training rather than mere self-control. In the mystery schools of Egypt, initiates were tested not only intellectually but emotionally. Priests believed uncontrolled emotional states distorted perception and weakened consciousness. A person ruled entirely by fear or rage became psychologically blind. One ancient account describes a candidate being led alone into a dark underground chamber beneath a temple. Strange sounds echoed through the stone corridors. Hidden priests whispered warnings from unseen corners. Symbols of death surrounded the initiate. The purpose was not cruelty, it was revelation. The priests wanted to observe whether fear would dominate perception completely. Many fled, some panicked. Others became lost inside their own imagination. But the few who remained calm despite uncertainty were considered ready for deeper knowledge. Why? Because they understood something essential. Emotion directs awareness. A fearful mind creates fearful interpretations automatically. This principle appears in nearly every ancient spiritual tradition. In Stoicism, emotional reaction was believed to distort reason. In Taoism, agitation disrupted harmony with the Tao. In Buddhism, attachment and aversion clouded perception. In Hermetic teachings, emotional vibration influenced mental reality itself. Different cultures, same insight. A consciousness is shaped emotionally before it is shaped intellectually. Modern neuroscience quietly confirms much of this ancient observation. Emotional states influence attention, memory, decision-making, and pattern recognition constantly. Fear narrows awareness towards survival. Chronic anger reshapes interpretation. Gratitude alters neurological focus toward opportunity and meaning. Emotion becomes a lens, and over time repeated emotional states become personality. There is a reason certain people seem trapped inside recurring realities. Some unconsciously rehearse anxiety daily until the nervous system expects threat automatically. Others rehearse resentment until bitterness colors every interaction. The ancient sages would say, these individuals are feeding emotional energies that continuously reinforce the same internal world. And the internal world eventually influences external outcomes. A fearful person hesitates, a resentful person isolates, an angry person creates conflict. Emotional energy becomes behavioral architecture. This is why ancient initiates practiced emotional discipline with extraordinary seriousness. Warrior monks trained calm under pressure. Stoic philosophers practiced hardship voluntarily to weaken fear. Hermetic students observed emotional reactions carefully before speaking or acting. Even ancient martial artists understood that uncontrolled emotion weakens perception and timing during combat. The emotional state determined effectiveness. There is an old story from a monastery high in the mountains of Tibet about a young student who asked his master why he still struggled spiritually despite years of study. The master handed him a cup filled to the edge with dark liquid. "What is this?" the student asked. "Poison," the master replied. The student quickly placed it down. Then the teacher asked, "If you carried that cup every day, what would happen?" "I would eventually drink from it accidentally," the student answered. The master nodded. "So why do you carry fear and resentment so carefully inside your mind?" The student never forgot the lesson. Most people assume emotions simply happen to them. But the ancients believed emotional states could be cultivated, strengthened, weakened, redirected, or transformed through awareness and discipline, not suppressed. Transformed, fear could become alertness. Anger could become focused action. Sorrow could become wisdom. This process was considered alchemy of consciousness itself. The ancient Hermeticists called it mental transmutation, the ability to shift internal states deliberately rather than remaining enslaved to them unconsciously, because whatever emotional state dominates consciousness repeatedly begins shaping reality from within outward. A fearful consciousness sees imprisonment everywhere. An awakened consciousness sees possibility. This does not mean pretending pain does not exist. Ancient wisdom was never naive about suffering. Death, illness, betrayal, loss, and uncertainty were understood deeply by every serious spiritual tradition. But the sages recognized something critical. The emotional interpretation of experience often determines whether suffering destroys a person or transforms them. One individual becomes bitter after hardship, another becomes wiser. Same pain, different consciousness, and over years, emotional habits become destiny quietly. The ancients therefore guarded emotional energy carefully because they believed the mind eventually becomes whatever it repeatedly feels. Fear repeated long enough becomes identity. Peace repeated long enough becomes presence, and whatever becomes identity eventually shapes the reality a person experiences daily. Chapter 10. The Parable of the Two Minds. In a small ancient city divided by trade routes and desert winds, there lived two men who experienced the same world, but inhabited entirely different realities. Both men lost their businesses during a season of political collapse. Both faced uncertainty. Both walked the same crowded streets each morning beneath the same grey sky. Yet one descended slowly into misery, while the other transformed entirely. The first man became consumed by bitterness. Every conversation strengthened his despair. Every setback confirmed his belief that life was hostile and unfair. He interpreted delay as punishment, criticism as attack, uncertainty as doom. Soon he stopped noticing opportunities altogether. He distrusted everyone. He expected betrayal constantly. His world became psychologically smaller each year. The second man also suffered deeply at first. He felt fear. He felt grief. But instead of allowing suffering to harden into identity, he began observing his own mind carefully. He noticed how thoughts repeated, how emotions shaped perception, how expectation influenced behavior. Rather than asking, "Why is life against me?" he began asking, What is this experience teaching me? That single shift changed everything. Slowly his awareness sharpened. He became calmer under pressure, more attentive, less reactive. He began seeing possibilities invisible to the other man because his consciousness was no longer completely consumed by fear. Years later, one lived imprisoned by resentment, while the other built a meaningful life from the exact same collapse. The ancient sages would say their worlds diverged internally before they diverged externally. This is the forgotten principle hidden beneath countless spiritual traditions. Consciousness filters experience continuously. Human beings rarely encounter objective reality directly. They encounter interpretations shaped by memory, emotion, identity, expectation, and belief. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius wrote during war, plague, political corruption, and personal loss. Yet again and again he reminded himself that events themselves do not automatically create suffering. Interpretation determines much of human experience. This did not mean denying hardship. It meant recognizing the immense psychological power hidden within perception. A fearful consciousness sees imprisonment. A disciplined consciousness sees challenge. A bitter consciousness sees insult. A wise consciousness sees instruction. Same event, different reality. This is why two individuals can walk through identical circumstances and emerge completely transformed in opposite directions. One collapses psychologically, another awakens. The difference often lies not in circumstance itself, but in the structure of consciousness interpreting circumstance. Ancient Vedic teachings described the mind as a lens coloring perception continuously. Taoist masters warned that disturbed consciousness distorts reality, like turbulent water distorts reflection. Hermetic traditions taught that internal states replicate externally over time through repeated behavior and perception. All pointed toward the same truth. Human beings participate in reality through consciousness itself. There is an old parable about two travelers entering the same city. Before entering, they meet an old gatekeeper sitting quietly beside the road. The first traveler asks, "What kind of people live here?" The gatekeeper replies, "What kind of people came from the place you left, terrible people?" The traveler answers, "Dishonest, selfish, cruel." The gatekeeper nods. "You will find the same here." Later another traveler asks the same question. Again the gatekeeper responds, "What kind of people came from where you left?" "Wonderful people," the traveler says, "generous, wise, welcoming." The old man smiles softly. "You will find the same here." A young boy watching nearby becomes confused. "How can both answers be true?" he asks. The gatekeeper replies, "Because people do not merely find reality, they bring themselves into it." This is the hidden mechanism of consciousness filtering experience. What dominates internally influences what becomes visible externally, not magically, psychologically, behaviorally, emotionally. A suspicious person unconsciously searches for betrayal. An ashamed person unconsciously expects rejection. A grateful person notices meaning others overlook. Consciousness acts like a filter, selecting which aspects of reality become emotionally real. And over years, these filters strengthen themselves through repetition. This is why ancient wisdom traditions emphasized self-observation so intensely. Before changing external conditions, one must understand the structure of the observing mind itself. Otherwise, unconscious patterns continue recreating similar experiences endlessly. The angry mind recreates conflict. The fearful mind recreates avoidance. The awakened mind begins recreating clarity, and slowly reality changes shape accordingly. not because the external world becomes perfect, but because consciousness itself transforms the experience of living within it. Chapter 11. Sacred Vibration and the Spoken Word. Before temples were built from stone, the ancients believed reality itself was spoken into existence. Across civilizations separated by oceans and centuries, one mysterious idea appeared again and again. Creation begins with vibration. The Egyptians believed sacred words carried force beyond ordinary language. The Greeks spoke of the Logos, the divine ordering intelligence underlying existence. In the opening of the Gospel of John appears the ancient phrase, "In the beginning was the Word," not merely speech power. The ancients did not treat words casually, because they believed language shapes consciousness long before it shapes the external world. A repeated phrase becomes belief. A belief becomes identity. Identity becomes behavior. And behavior slowly reshapes destiny. Speech becomes architecture. There is a reason ancient initiates guarded language carefully. In Egyptian mystery traditions, priests spent years mastering sacred pronunciation before entering deeper teachings. Certain sounds, prayers, and tonal patterns were believed to influence consciousness directly. Whether symbolic or literal, the psychological effect was profound. Words altered inner state. Modern people often speak without awareness. I always fail. Nothing ever changes. I am broken. I am unlucky. Repeated often enough, these phrases become internal commands. The mind listens constantly. Ancient Hermetic teachers understood this deeply. They believed vibration existed not only in sound, but in thought itself. Every repeated mental pattern strengthened corresponding emotional and behavioral states. In this way, speech became energetic instruction, shaping the subconscious gradually over time. This principle appears in nearly every wisdom tradition. The Stoics warned against undisciplined speech because words intensified emotional states. Taoist sages preferred silence over careless language because speech could disturb inner harmony. Vedic teachings emphasized mantra repetition as a way of reorganizing consciousness itself. The ancients knew something modern psychology now confirms. Language changes perception. The words repeated internally influence emotional expectation, self-image, and even physiological response. There is an old story from Alexandria about a philosopher who kept a small bowl of water near the entrance of his home. Each morning before speaking, he would stare into the water silently. A student finally asked him why. The old man replied, "Words disturb reality long before they disturb air." The student did not understand, so the philosopher pointed to the water. When untouched, it reflects clearly, but one movement changes its surface completely. Then he touched the water gently. Ripples spread outward instantly. So it is with speech. The ancients believed spoken words create psychological ripples that extend far beyond the moment itself. A child repeatedly called weak may carry weakness internally for decades. A person constantly speaking fear eventually conditions the nervous system toward anxiety automatically. Words become emotional atmosphere. This is why sacred traditions placed enormous emphasis on verbal discipline. Some initiates practice days of silence simply to become aware of how impulsively human beings speak. Others repeated sacred phrases designed to stabilize consciousness deliberately, because eventually they realized speech programs the mind, and the mind quietly shapes reality. There is another layer to this wisdom that modern culture often overlooks. Words do not only affect the person hearing them, they affect the person speaking them. A resentful person strengthens resentment through constant repetition. An angry person deepens anger through verbal rehearsal. A fearful person reinforces fear through habitual narration. Every repeated statement strengthens internal pathways. The ancients therefore viewed language as either creative force or destructive force, depending on consciousness behind it. One Taoist teacher explained this through a simple analogy. "Words," he said, "are arrows shot first into your own spirit before reaching anyone else. This is why certain people radiate heaviness wherever they go. Their internal dialogue has become saturated with bitterness, fear, and hostility. Others radiate calm because their speech reflects inner order rather than emotional chaos. Consciousness speaks before the mouth does." Ancient mystics believed the world responds not only to outward action, but to inward vibration carried continuously through thought, speech, and emotional energy. Whether interpreted spiritually or psychologically, the principle remains powerful. What you repeatedly declare internally begins organizing perception around itself. The person who constantly says life is meaningless eventually stops noticing meaning. The person who constantly rehearses failure unconsciously avoids risk. The person who repeatedly cultivates gratitude gradually sees abundance others ignore. Speech shapes identity invisibly. This is why ancient schools of wisdom taught students to observe language carefully. Not because words alone magically alter the universe, but because words alter consciousness, and consciousness shapes experience continuously. There is an old Hermetic saying, "The tongue reveals the hidden structure of the soul." The ancients understood that speech exposes the condition of consciousness itself. But more importantly, they believed disciplined speech could transform consciousness over time. Careless words create careless minds. Intentional words create intentional minds. And eventually, the inner voice becomes the invisible author of reality itself. Chapter 12. The Ancient Art of Inner Silence. There are truths the ancients believed could never be heard through noise. Only silence reveals them. In modern life, silence often feels uncomfortable. Many people fill every empty moment immediately with music. Screens, conversation, distraction, stimulation, endless thought. Yet ancient wisdom traditions across the world treated silence not as absence, but as a doorway, a sacred condition of perception. The Hermetic initiates practiced silence before receiving deeper teachings. Taoist sages withdrew into mountains to quiet the mind. Desert mystics wandered alone beneath endless skies seeking stillness beyond language itself. Why? Because noise weakens perception, not only external noise, internal noise, endless thought, constant emotional reaction, mental chatter repeating fear, memory, anxiety, comparison, and distraction without pause. The ancients believed most human beings never truly encounter reality because their minds remain too loud to perceive clearly. There is an old Taoist story about a student who traveled for months to study under a revered master known for extraordinary wisdom. When the student finally arrived, he immediately began asking questions. What is enlightenment? How do I master consciousness? How can I understand the hidden laws of reality? The old master simply poured tea into the student's cup and kept pouring. Tea overflowed onto the floor. "Stop!" the student shouted. "The cup is already full." The master smiled gently. "So is your mind." The lesson was unmistakable. Noise prevents perception. A mind overflowing with constant reaction cannot recognize deeper awareness beneath thought itself. This is why silence became essential in ancient spiritual disciplines. Not because silence was mystical decoration, but because stillness revealed patterns normally hidden beneath distraction. The monks understood something profound. When external noise fades, internal noise becomes visible. A person sitting quietly for 10 minutes quickly discovers how restless the mind truly is. Thoughts race endlessly, emotions surface unexpectedly, forgotten fears emerge from beneath distraction. Most people immediately escape back into stimulations because stillness exposes the condition of consciousness directly, but the ancient initiates stayed. And through remaining present, awareness deepened. There are accounts from Hermetic schools describing students spending long periods in silence before receiving sacred instruction. Teachers believed silence sharpened perception and weakened impulsive thinking. Words became more meaningful after stillness purified attention. Even the Stoics practiced forms of internal silence. Marcus Aurelius withdrew inward constantly despite ruling an empire surrounded by war, disease, betrayal, and political chaos. His writings reveal a man training himself to remain internally calm regardless of external disorder. Stillness became strength. The Taoists perhaps understood this most beautifully. They believed reality itself emerges from silent balance. Excess movement disturbs harmony. Excess speech weakens awareness. Excess reaction blinds perception, Laozi wrote. To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders. Not because stillness controls reality magically, because stillness perceives reality accurately. A disturbed lake cannot reflect clearly, neither can a disturbed mind. Modern life often conditions human beings toward permanent fragmentation. Constant alerts, arguments, stimulation, entertainment, and emotional overload scatter attention endlessly. People lose the ability to remain alone with their own consciousness peacefully. Yet the ancients warned this fragmentation weakens inner authority. A distracted person becomes reactive. A reactive person becomes controllable. A noisy mind loses access to deeper awareness. There is an old story about a monk who lived in complete solitude for many years beside a remote mountain temple. Travelers occasionally visited him seeking wisdom. One impatient visitor asked, "What did you gain from all those years of silence?" The monk replied softly, "At first I heard only noise. Then I heard my fears, and after that, then I heard the thoughts beneath the fears, and finally," the monk looked toward the mountains quietly. "Finally," he said, "I heard nothing, and in that nothing, I understood everything." The ancients believed silence reveals what distraction conceals, not supernatural secrets necessarily, but awareness itself, the patterns behind reaction, the fears beneath ambition, the emotional habits shaping identity unconsciously. The still mind begins observing rather than obeying thought automatically, and this changes consciousness fundamentally, because awareness creates separation from unconscious patterns. A silent mind notices anger before becoming consumed by it, notices fear before surrendering to it, notices thought without instantly believing it. This is why ancient masters guarded silence so carefully. In stillness, perception sharpens. In stillness, emotional storms weaken. In stillness, consciousness begins remembering itself beneath conditioning. And eventually, a person realizes something the ancient discovered long ago. The deepest power was never hidden in noise, but in the awareness quietly watching beneath it all. Chapter 13. The prison of unconscious thought. Most human beings believe they are thinking freely. The ancients believed otherwise. They taught that the average person lives inside invisible prisons constructed from repetitive thoughts, inherited beliefs, emotional habits, and unconscious reactions, repeated so often they begin to feel like reality itself. Chains of the mind. In Hermetic teachings, unconscious living was considered a kind of sleep. In Gnosticism, humanity was described as spiritually forgetful, moving through existence unaware of its deeper nature. In Buddhism, repetitive mental attachment created suffering endlessly. Even the Stoics warned that uncontrolled thought gradually enslaves perception. Different civilizations, same warning. An unconscious mind repeats itself constantly. There is an old story from a desert monastery about a traveler who visited an elderly mystic known for unusual wisdom. The traveler complained bitterly about his life. "Everywhere I go," he said, "people betray me. Misfortune follows me. Nothing changes." The old mystic listened silently before asking a strange question. "How many times have you told yourself this story?" The traveler frowned. "What story?" The old man leaned forward gently. "The one you now call your life." The traveler became quiet. For the first time, he realized he had been repeating the same internal narrative for years. The ancients understood something most people never notice. Thoughts repeated continuously stop feeling like thoughts. They begin feeling like identity. And identity quietly shapes behavior, expectation, emotional reaction, and perception itself. A child repeatedly told he is weak may unconsciously fear challenge throughout adulthood. A person raised around constant anxiety may interpret uncertainty as danger automatically. Entire belief systems are inherited before being examined consciously even once. Mental conditioning becomes invisible because repetition normalizes it. This is why ancient spiritual traditions emphasized self-observation so intensely. Before transforming reality externally, one had to observe the structure of consciousness internally. Otherwise, unconscious patterns continued recreating similar experiences endlessly. The ancients compared unconscious thought to a river carving deeper grooves through stone over time. Every repeated fear strengthens fear. Every repeated resentment deepens bitterness. Every repeated limitation reinforces psychological boundaries until they appear immovable. Yet most of these structures were never consciously chosen. They were absorbed, inherited, repeated unconsciously. The Upanishads described human beings as trapped inside illusion, not because reality itself was false, but because conditioned perception distorted reality continuously. The ego became a filter interpreting experience automatically according to memory, fear, desire, and learned identity. Modern psychology would later describe similar mechanisms through conditioning, cognitive bias, and subconscious patterning. The ancients recognized them through direct observation of consciousness itself. There is a reason wisdom traditions placed such importance on awakening. They believed most people were psychologically asleep, living through automatic thought loops, repeating emotional reactions unconsciously, reliving old narratives daily. One ancient Taoist teacher described the ordinary mind as a room full of echoes mistaken for truth. What a haunting image! Most thoughts are not even original. They are fragments of parents, society, fear, memory, culture, trauma, comparison, and repetition speaking through the mind endlessly. And because these patterns repeat constantly, they begin shaping external reality through behavior and attention. A fearful person unconsciously avoids opportunities. A resentful person recreates conflict. A hopeless person stops recognizing possibility. Thought becomes destiny slowly. This is why awareness is so powerful. Awareness interrupts automation. The moment a person observes a thought consciously rather than automatically obeying it, separation begins. The individual realizes, I am witnessing this thought, therefore I am not identical to it. That realization changes everything. There is an old story from India about a young seeker who visited a sage in the forest, asking how to free himself from suffering. The sage handed him a candle and led him into a dark cave. Inside the cave, terrifying shadows covered the walls. Strange shapes moved in every direction. The young man panicked. "What are these creatures?" he whispered. The sage calmly lifted the candle higher. Instantly the shadows disappeared. There had never been monsters at all. Only darkness. The sage spoke softly. "Awareness is the flame." The ancients believed unconscious thought derives much of its power from invisibility. Once deeply observed, many patterns weaken naturally because consciousness is no longer fully identified with them. A person begins noticing, "This fear repeats constantly. This anger is inherited. This belief is not truly mine." And through observation, psychological freedom slowly begins, not instantly, but gradually. The Stoics practiced this through reflective journaling and disciplined self-examination. Buddhist monks practiced mindful awareness of thought. Hermetic initiates studied internal states carefully before attempting to influence external conditions. Because unconscious thought distorts reality, awareness clarifies it. Most people spend their entire lives trapped inside mental prisons they never consciously examine. Ancient wisdom sought not merely knowledge, but liberation from unconscious patterns controlling perception invisibly. The awakened mind begins questioning automatically repeated thoughts instead of surrendering to them. And in that moment, consciousness starts reclaiming authority over itself. The prison weakens, the observer awakens, and reality begins changing from the inside outward. Chapter 14. Synchronicity and hidden order. Have you ever thought deeply about someone only for them to contact you unexpectedly hours later, or searched desperately for direction only to encounter the exact words you needed from a stranger, a forgotten book, or a seemingly accidental conversation? The modern world often dismisses such moments as coincidence. The ancients rarely did. Across civilizations, mystics believed reality contains hidden patterns linking consciousness and experience in ways not fully visible to ordinary perception. They taught that life is not merely chaotic randomness, but an interconnected field of meaning where inner states influence what becomes noticeable externally, a hidden order. Centuries later, the psychologist Carl Jung would describe these moments as synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that appear mysteriously connected without obvious physical cause. But long before Jung gave the phenomenon a modern name, ancient spiritual traditions were already exploring the same mystery. The Hermeticists believed consciousness and reality mirrored one another through invisible correspondence. Taoist sages taught that alignment with deeper harmony caused life to unfold through uncanny timing and symbolic patterns. Ancient Egyptian mystics viewed certain encounters and symbols as messages emerging from deeper layers of consciousness itself. The idea appears everywhere. Different language, same mystery. There is an old story from Persia about a scholar searching obsessively for wisdom hidden within ancient manuscripts. For years he studied endlessly yet felt spiritually empty. One evening, exhausted and discouraged, he wandered into the marketplace during heavy rain. Seeking shelter, he entered a tiny candle shop owned by an old man. The scholar complained bitterly. "I have spent my life searching for truth," he said, "yet I remain lost." The old candle maker smiled quietly while lighting another flame. Then he spoke words the scholar would never forget. "You search for wisdom like a man staring at the stars while ignoring the sunrise beside him." The scholar froze. That exact sentence had appeared earlier that morning in a forgotten manuscript he had read moments before leaving home. The coincidence shook him deeply. The ancients believed such moments mattered because they interrupted ordinary unconscious perception. Suddenly, life no longer appeared entirely mechanical. Meaning emerged unexpectedly through patterns, timing, symbols, and emotional resonance, not superstition. Attention, a consciousness intensely focused on certain ideas, begins recognizing related patterns more frequently. Modern psychology explains part of this through selective attention. The mind notices what aligns with emotional and mental focus, but the ancients believed something deeper also occurs. They believed consciousness participates in reality through resonance itself. A fearful mind notices threat constantly. A grateful mind notices blessing. A seeking mind notices guidance. Attention reorganizes experience. This does not mean every coincidence carries cosmic significance. Ancient wisdom warned against obsession and fantasy. But they also believed modern people underestimate how profoundly consciousness filters and organizes perception continuously. There is a reason certain patterns suddenly appear repeatedly during periods of transformation. When awareness shifts internally, external attention shifts with it. New symbols, people, opportunities, and insights emerge because consciousness has changed what it is capable of perceiving. The world begins looking different because the observer has changed. Jung himself became fascinated by ancient mystical traditions precisely because they understood symbolic patterns psychologically long before modern science explored them. He believed synchronicities revealed moments where inner and outer reality seemed mysteriously connected through meaning rather than direct causation. The ancients might have simply called this alignment. There is an old Taoist parable about a fisherman drifting peacefully along a river at dawn. As the mist lifted, he noticed birds suddenly changing direction overhead. At the exact moment, the current beneath his boat shifted. To others, it would have seemed meaningless. To the fisherman, it revealed hidden harmony. Everything connected. The ancients trained awareness to recognize subtle relationships modern minds often ignore entirely. Sacred geometry, astrology, symbolic dreams, natural cycles, and synchronicity all reflected their belief that reality contains deeper layers of pattern beneath surface chaos. Whether interpreted spiritually or psychologically, one truth remains undeniable. Human beings experience what consciousness trains itself to notice, and most people notice very little because distraction fragments awareness continuously. But when the mind becomes quieter, when attention sharpens, when consciousness deepens, life itself begins revealing strange connections previously invisible, not because reality suddenly changes, but because perception finally awakens enough to recognize the hidden patterns already there. Chapter 15. The Energy of Identity. Long before modern psychology spoke about self-image, the ancient sages already understood a dangerous truth. Human beings rarely rise beyond the identity they secretly accept. A man may desire wealth, yet internally believe he is destined to struggle. A woman may long for peace while unconsciously identifying with suffering. Another may seek love while carrying the silent conviction that they are unworthy of being chosen. The ancients believed reality bends gradually around these hidden assumptions, not instantly, but relentlessly. There is an old Hermetic phrase once spoken quietly inside mystery schools. Become what you contemplate. The statement appears simple at first, yet beneath it lies one of the deepest laws of consciousness ever taught. Whatever occupies the inner throne of identity slowly reshapes perception, emotion, behavior, and eventually experience itself. Identity becomes energy, and energy organizes reality. The Egyptian initiates understood this symbolically through their sacred rituals of transformation. A student entering deeper mysteries often received a new name after years of discipline. The name represented more than ceremony. It signified the death of an old self and the birth of a new consciousness, because the ancients believed transformation begins internally long before it appears externally. Modern people often attempt the reverse. They try changing circumstances first, while preserving the same identity beneath them. They seek confidence while continuing to identify as fearful. They seek abundance while internally rehearsing scarcity. They seek peace while remaining psychologically attached to chaos. The outer effort collapses because the inner structure remains unchanged. Identity always pulls behavior back toward itself. There is an old story from Alexandria about a sculptor famous for creating statues so lifelike they unsettled those who looked upon them. One day a young apprentice asked how he achieved such realism. The sculptor replied, "I do not carve bodies, I carve identity." The apprentice looked confused, so the old man pointed toward two unfinished statues. "One man believes himself defeated," he said. "The other believes himself chosen by destiny." Before either speaks, their entire posture reveals their inner world. Then he added quietly, "The invisible always appears visibly eventually." The ancients believed consciousness expresses itself through the body, voice, choices, relationships, and emotional atmosphere continuously. Identity radiates outward through countless subtle behaviors the conscious mind rarely notices. This is why ancient initiates focused intensely on internal transformation. The Stoics trained themselves to embody calm before facing chaos. Taoist sages cultivated harmony internally before attempting action externally. Gnostic traditions taught that awakening required remembering one's divine nature beneath conditioned identity. They understood a profound principle: behavior follows self-concept automatically. A person who deeply identifies as weak unconsciously avoids challenge. A person identifying as unlucky notices failure more than opportunity. A person identifying as wise behaves differently even in silence. Identity becomes behavioral gravity. Modern neuroscience would later confirm parts of this ancient wisdom. Repeated self-perception influences neural pathways, emotional expectation, and decision-making patterns. The brain constantly attempts to remain consistent with internal identity. The ancients observed this directly through life itself. There is a reason many people sabotage opportunities immediately after receiving them. The new reality conflicts with their internal identity. And eventually, the mind pulls experience back toward what feels psychologically familiar. Even suffering becomes addictive when identity attaches to it long enough. This is why ancient wisdom emphasized contemplation so strongly. What you contemplate repeatedly, you begin becoming, not magically, psychologically, energetically, emotionally, spiritually. There is a haunting story from a monastery hidden in the Syrian desert. A traveler once arrived seeking guidance after years of failure and disappointment. "I have tried everything," he told the old monk. "Nothing changes." The monk studied him quietly before asking, "Who are you when nobody is watching?" The traveler answered with confusion. "I do not understand." The monk leaned closer. "When you walk alone, when no performance is needed, what identity speaks inside your mind continuously?" The traveler became silent because for the first time He realized his inner voice constantly repeated the same unconscious truths. I am behind. I am powerless. Life never works for me. The monk nodded gently. And yet you wonder why reality keeps reflecting them. The ancients believed self-image silently shapes perception long before external results appear. A person changes not merely by forcing behavior temporarily, but by transforming the identity from which behavior emerges naturally. Identity precedes action, always. This is why the greatest transformations in history often began invisibly. Before becoming leaders, visionaries, sages, or creators, individuals first experienced an internal shift in self-concept. Something changed in the unseen architecture of consciousness itself, and once identity changed, behavior followed almost automatically. The Hermetic initiates understood this deeply. They believed reality mirrors the inner state, because consciousness continuously radiates expectation, focus, emotion, and action according to identity. Not every passing thought matters, but sustained self-concept shapes destiny profoundly. There is an old saying among certain mystical schools: the world does not ask who you wish to be, it responds to who you believe yourself to be. And perhaps that is why the ancients guarded identity so carefully, because eventually they discovered the terrifying and beautiful truth: a human being becomes whatever consciousness repeatedly accepts as true. Chapter 16. The collapse of false reality. A prisoner who has lived in darkness long enough eventually fears the light. The ancients understood this not only as political truth, but psychological truth. They believed many human limitations survive not because they are fundamentally real, but because consciousness continuously agrees to them unconsciously. Fear sustains illusion, awareness dissolves it. In the Upanishads, reality distorted by ignorance was called Maya, not meaning existence itself was unreal, but that perception becomes clouded through attachment, conditioning, and false identification. The Stoics similarly taught that suffering often emerges less from events themselves than from the interpretations attached to them. The Hermeticists carried this even further. They believed the human mind constructs invisible prisons through belief, fear, and unconscious repetition. Over time, these psychological structures begin appearing solid simply because they have never been questioned deeply. A person says, "I could never change. I am too old. This is simply who I am. Nothing better is possible for me." And eventually, these statements stop sounding like thoughts. They become reality. There is an old tale from India about a tiger cub raised among sheep after becoming separated from its mother during a storm. The cub grew believing itself weak, timid, and powerless because it had never known otherwise. One day, an old tiger descended from the mountains and saw the strange sight: a tiger trembling among sheep. The old tiger dragged the frightened animal toward a still lake and forced it to look into the water. At first, the younger tiger resisted desperately. Then suddenly it saw its own reflection clearly. Everything changed in one instant. The ancients loved such stories because they symbolized awakening from false identity and inherited limitation. Many people live inside psychological cages, constructed entirely from conditioning, absorbed unconsciously throughout life. Fear keeps the cage intact, awareness weakens it. This does not mean all limitations are imaginary. The ancients were not naive. They understood material conditions, hardship, aging, and suffering exist. But they also recognized how dramatically perception influences human experience within those conditions. Two people face difficulty. One collapses psychologically before the struggle even begins. The other adapts, learns and grows stronger through it. External reality matters, but consciousness determines how reality is experienced internally. Marcus Aurelius ruled during plague, war, betrayal, and political instability. Yet his writings reveal a man refusing to surrender inner authority to external chaos. He believed the mind possessed the ability to reinterpret experience consciously, rather than becoming enslaved by fear automatically. The ancients viewed this as liberation, not escape from reality, clarity about reality. There is an old Taoist story about a man terrified of crossing a narrow bridge suspended above a canyon. Frozen with fear, he could not move forward. An old traveler approached calmly and asked, "What exactly are you afraid of?" The frightened man pointed downward. "The fall." The traveler shook his head gently. "No, you are afraid of the picture in your mind." That distinction changed everything. The ancients understood imagination can strengthen illusion powerfully. A feared future repeated mentally often feels more real than present reality itself. Entire lives become controlled by imagined disasters that never actually occur. Fear distorts perception. Awareness restores proportion. This is why conscious observation matters so deeply. The moment a person observes fear, rather than automatically identifying with it, psychological space appears. The illusion weakens slightly. I notice fear, instead of, I am fear. That separation is transformative. Ancient Buddhist teachings emphasized observing thought without attachment. Taoist sages practiced non-resistance toward mental activity. Hermetic traditions encouraged witnessing consciousness itself, rather than becoming consumed by emotional storms automatically. Because awareness changes experience. A person consumed unconsciously by anger behaves one way. A person observing anger consciously behaves differently entirely. Observation interrupts identification, and identification is what gives many illusions their power. There is a reason ancient wisdom traditions valued stillness so highly. In silence, unconscious distortions become visible. Patterns hidden beneath distraction suddenly emerge clearly. Fear, resentment, insecurity, ego, and inherited belief can finally be examined rather than obeyed automatically. And many begin collapsing under observation alone, like shadows disappearing beneath light. There is an ancient saying found in multiple forms across mystical traditions: what is seen clearly loses power. The ancients believed awareness itself possesses transformative force because consciousness stops feeding illusion unconsciously once it becomes visible. The fearful story weakens, the inherited identity cracks. The false limitation begins dissolving, not through force, through seeing. Eventually, a person realizes something extraordinary. Many of the walls controlling their life were never truly walls, only unexamined thoughts repeated long enough to feel real. Chapter 17, Consciousness and Creative Authority. For thousands of years, humanity has been taught to see itself as small. A fragile creature trapped inside an indifferent universe, a passive observer drifting through forces beyond control. But the ancient wisdom traditions taught something radically different. They believed the human being participates in reality itself, not as an all-powerful ruler, but as a conscious participant within a living system of mind, energy, perception, and meaning. The Stoics called this deeper intelligence the Logos, the Taoists called it the Tao, the Hermeticists spoke of the divine mind, different names. Same revelation, reality is not entirely separate from consciousness. And consciousness is not powerless within reality. There is an old Hermetic story about a young initiate who traveled across Egypt, seeking secret knowledge hidden within the temples of the Nile. After years of study, rituals, and discipline, he finally stood before an elderly master inside a chamber illuminated only by oil lamps. The initiate expected to receive sacred formulas, magical symbols, or hidden prophecies. Instead, the old master asked only one question: "Do you still believe the world happens only to you?" The initiate hesitated. The master continued, "Until that illusion collapses, wisdom remains impossible." The ancients believed most people live unconsciously reactive lives. They react emotionally to events, absorb fear from society, imitate the beliefs of others, and surrender attention continuously without realizing consciousness itself shapes experience profoundly. They become leaves in the wind, pulled everywhere, centered nowhere. Ancient initiates sought the opposite condition: eternal mastery, not domination over life, alignment within it. The Stoics trained perception so external chaos could not easily enslave the mind. Taoist sages practiced harmony with natural order rather than endless forceful struggle. Hermetic schools taught mental discipline because thought itself was considered a creative influence upon reality. All of these traditions pointed toward one central truth: master yourself internally, and your relationship with reality changes externally. There is an old story from China about a governor who ruled a province suffering from unrest, poverty, and corruption. Previous leaders had tried controlling the population through punishment and force, yet disorder only increased. Then a quiet philosopher became governor. Instead of reacting emotionally to chaos, he cultivated unusual calmness and discipline. He listened more carefully, spoke less impulsively, acted with patience instead of panic. Gradually, the atmosphere around him began changing. Officials stopped shouting. Citizens became less fearful. Conflicts weakened, not instantly, but steadily. One advisor asked him the secret behind this transformation. The governor answered, "A disturbed mind multiplies disturbance. A balanced mind reorganizes what surrounds it." The ancients understood emotional states spread socially like invisible currents. Fear amplifies fear. Anger provokes anger. Calmness stabilizes groups. Courage inspires courage. Consciousness influences environments continuously. Modern psychology would later explore emotional contagion, mirror neurons, and behavioral resonance. Ancient wisdom traditions observed these principles directly long before scientific terminologies existed. Eternal mastery becomes external influence, not through mystical fantasy, through perception, behavior, attention, emotion, and presence shaping reality continuously. This is why ancient spiritual traditions emphasized self-knowledge so intensely. A person unaware of their own consciousness becomes controlled by unconscious patterns automatically, but awareness creates choice, and choice changes destiny. The Taoists compared conscious living to a skilled sailor moving with the current rather than fighting the ocean endlessly. The sailor does not control the sea itself, yet through alignment, awareness, timing, and discipline, he moves farther with less force. This was the ancient understanding of power, not frantic control. Alamazand, there is an old saying from the Corpus Hermeticum: "He who knows himself knows the universe." At first, the phrase sounds symbolic, but the ancients meant something deeper. They believed consciousness and reality mirror one another continuously. A fragmented inner world produces fragmented experience externally. A disciplined inner world creates greater clarity, stability, and influence outwardly. Not because the universe magically obeys desire, but because perception, emotion, attention, and behavior reorganize around inner state constantly. A fearful consciousness sees obstacles first. A clear consciousness sees possibilities. An exhausted consciousness creates confusion. A centered consciousness creates direction. The external world changes partly because the observer changes. This is why ancient wisdom treated consciousness itself as sacred territory. What controls the mind eventually shapes the life. There is a reason great spiritual traditions warned constantly about distraction, unconscious emotion, and mental chaos. They believed a person who cannot govern attention internally becomes governed externally by fear, manipulation, impulse, and circumstance. But the awakened individual gradually reclaims authority. Thought becomes deliberate, emotion becomes observed, attention becomes intentional. And slowly, reality begins responding differently. Not because the person escaped life, but because they finally began participating consciously within it. The ancients believed this was humanity's forgotten inheritance, not domination over reality, partnership with it. And those who mastered themselves internally often appeared strangely powerful externally because their consciousness no longer moved unconsciously with every passing storm. They became stable centers within unstable worlds, and stability itself became influence. Chapter 18, The Forbidden Conclusion. The ancient teachers believed humanity did not lose its power accidentally. It forgot. Forgot through distraction, forgot through fear, forgot through endless identification with external noise. The Hermeticists taught that human beings possess creative consciousness, yet live unaware of it. The Gnostics believed humanity carried a divine spark buried beneath illusion and unconscious conditioning. The Stoics warned that most suffering emerges because people surrender inner authority to external events constantly. Different traditions, same conclusion. Most people do not direct consciousness consciously. And whatever directs consciousness eventually shapes reality. There is an old legend about a hidden library beneath the sands of Egypt containing forbidden teachings guarded for centuries by initiates. According to the story, a young seeker once traveled across deserts searching desperately for this wisdom. After many years, he finally found the entrance and asked the old guardian inside, "What is the greatest secret hidden here?" The guardian smiled sadly. That human beings search the world for power while abandoning the mind that creates their experience of the world. The seeker expected sacred rituals, ancient prophecies, high formulas. Instead, the guardian handed him a polished bronze mirror. "Study this carefully," he said. For most people spend their entire lives without truly seeing who shapes their reality. The ancients believed consciousness directs experience continuously, whether a person realizes it or not. Attention shapes perception, emotion shapes interpretation, belief shapes behavior, identity shapes action, and repeated internal states slowly become external patterns over time, not perfectly, not magically, but consistently enough to transform entire lives. This is why ancient wisdom focused so intensely on awareness itself. Before attempting to influence the outer world, the initiate first learned to observe thought, emotion, reaction, fear, desire, and attention internally, because unconscious consciousness creates unconscious reality. There is an old Taoist image describing the ordinary human mind as muddy water constantly stirred by reaction, distraction, and emotional noise. The more violently a person struggles within the water, the less clearly they can see. But when stillness appears, clarity emerges naturally. And once clarity appears, life begins changing in subtle but profound ways. A person notices destructive thought patterns sooner. Emotional reactions lose unconscious power. Fear weakens beneath observation. Attention becomes more deliberate. choices improve, relationships shift, opportunities once invisible become noticeable. Reality reorganizes slowly around a transformed consciousness. This was the forbidden conclusion hidden beneath countless ancient teachings. Human beings continuously participate in shaping their experience through the quality of consciousness they cultivate daily. The ancients never claimed life could be controlled completely. Storms still come, loss still exists, aging still arrives. Yet they believed inner mastery changes how reality unfolds psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally, and spiritually, and that changes everything. There is a reason ancient initiates practiced disciplines of silence, observation, breath control, contemplation, journaling, fasting, meditation, prayer, and self-reflection. These were not empty rituals. They were technologies of consciousness, methods for reclaiming awareness from unconscious patterns, methods for stabilizing inner reality. Because once consciousness stabilizes, external life often begins stabilizing as well. The transformation rarely happens dramatically, it happens quietly, a calmer reaction, a wiser decision, a clearer perception, a more disciplined focus. A different emotional atmosphere. Small shifts repeated consistently eventually alter entire destinies. This is why the ancients measured wisdom not by information, but by inner state. A person filled with knowledge yet ruled by fear remained asleep. A person mastering consciousness became free. And perhaps that is the final challenge hidden within these ancient teachings. For the next 30 days, observe yourself carefully. Observe your thoughts without immediately believing them. Observe your emotional reactions without surrendering to them. Observe where your attention goes daily. Observe which identities, fears, and patterns repeat constantly beneath awareness. Do this honestly, not to judge yourself, but to finally see clearly. Because the ancients believed observation itself begins transformation. And once consciousness awakens fully, reality never appears the same again. Remember this final line carefully. What controls your consciousness controls your reality.